Our culture teaches us to be people of falsehood, but Jesus says that truth will set you free. We need to learn the truth of the ninth commandment against lying. Travis Harmon is the director of distance learning at Heritage Christian University, and he preaches for the Collinwood Church of Christ in Collinwood, Tennessee. In this lesson, he helps us think about the ninth commandment.
There's a old joke that preachers tell about a preacher who was walking down the road and he came across this group of little boys. And the little boys were all gathered around something, and the preacher kind of stooped over to see what was going on. And when he looked in, there was a puppy in the middle of all these little boys. And the preacher kind of got worried about what was going on here, and he said, "Hey, what are you boys doing?" And one of the little boys looked up at the preacher and said, "Well, sir, what we're doing is we all want the puppy, and what we decided to do is we're all going to tell a lie, and whoever tells the best lie is going to get the puppy." And the preacher stepped back and he said, "I have never heard of something so horrible in all my life. When I was a little boy, we would not have even thought about doing something so wicked and so horrible." And all the little boys hung their head. And they kind of looked at each other and nodded. And then one of the little boys picked up the puppy and said, "Sir, here you go. You won." It's really kind of the way it is, because all of us, if there's one thing that we all struggle with, if there's a sin that every one of us at some point in our life that we've committed, it's lying. Every one of us have struggled at some point in our life. We've told a lie. This is what the ninth commandment is about. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 16, it says, "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor." Of course, we understand that in the Mosaical age, what happens is their court system, their legal system, is actually based upon witness testimony. And if you have a court system that's based on witness testimony, you have to have witnesses who have integrity. Because if your witnesses do not have integrity, then your system has no integrity. And so what you have to do is you have to first have a foundation that is built on something that's solid. And so you have to have witnesses who are solid and who are reliable and who are trustworthy. And so God issues this command and says, "You will not be deceitful and you will not bear false witness." Of course, the command is really broader than just court proceedings. It's really a prohibition on dishonesty and deceit. In Psalm 51, Psalm 51 is one of my favorite passages in all of Scripture. Psalm 51 is so beautiful. And I think one of the reasons that it's so beautiful is because we see something that we don't normally see, and that is true, raw honesty. Thought a lot about the Diary of Anne Frank, and one of the reasons that I think the Diary of Anne Frank so captures us and so enamors us is because it's something that we don't normally see, and that is 100% honesty. She wasn't writing that so that somebody would read it years down the road. She was writing that as just a collection of her own memories, and I think that that's one of the reasons that brutal, unbridled honesty is something that's really interesting to us because we see it so rarely. In Psalm 51, I think that you see the same thing. In Psalm 51, you see David in a moment where his heart is bare, and you see the raw emotion and the raw honesty of David, who is without any type of protection whatsoever. He's opened himself up before God, and we get to see that. And I think that level of honesty is something that is really intriguing to us. And the passage in Psalm 51 is so honest, and the emotion is so raw, it's so poetic, it's just magical in every sense. But there's a particular verse in Psalm 51 where David says that it gives the idea that David is saying that people are born sinful. Now, there has been a lot of debate and a lot of talk about this verse in Psalm 51, In verse 5, behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. I don't think that David has any intention at all, or I am absolutely confident. There is no doubt in my mind David is not teaching any type of doctrine of inherited sin. And if you go back and you study the original text and you study the original language, I think what you're going to come to the conclusion of is that David actually is saying exactly what the text says. And there's a lot of debate over different translations and how this is translated. What David is saying is, I was born a sinner. David is not saying, and he is not trying to teach any type of doctrine of inherited sin. But David is saying, I am bad, I am evil, and I'm a sinner. And we all recognize this as hyperbole. Hyperbole is a rhetorical device where you exaggerate to make a point. And that's what David's doing. If you go back and you look at this in different translations, you're going to have to come to the conclusion that David is not teaching a doctrine, but David is saying, I was born a sinner. And what he's trying to communicate to us is how wicked he feels, how bad he feels, and the amount of guilt that's on top of him because of what he's done. And of course, this is written right after his sin, or about his sin with Bathsheba. When you go back and you look at Psalm 58, you realize that David does this. This is an issue of poetry. In Psalm 58, David says something that's very, very similar. In Psalm 58, verse 3, he says, even from birth, the wicked go astray. From the womb, they are wayward, spreading lies. David says that little babies, they walk out of the womb and they just come out telling lies. Well, we know that that is not true. We know that that's not intended for us to receive it literally. David's not saying, now it is poetry and it is intended to be a shocking mental image. David is saying that wicked people, they walk out of the womb and the first thing that they do is they start telling lies. Well, we know that babies, they have to learn to walk, they have to learn to talk, and then they have to learn to lie before they can do that. So we know that it's not literal. The same thing I think is true in Psalm 51. David's not saying literally, I was born a sinner. What he's saying is, I am bad, I'm evil. And in Psalm 58, he's trying to convince us, he's trying to show us just how wicked people are. And wicked people are so wicked that it's from the day of their birth that they come out telling lies. And again, it's not supposed to be literal. It's supposed to be interpreted as figurative and poetic to communicate. It's hyperbole. It's an exaggeration to make a point. And I think that that's what it is. But it is kind of interesting to think about because at some point, we do learn to lie. We do learn to walk, and we do learn to talk, and we do learn to lie, and not necessarily in that order. Because it's just something that happens to us that we are in a situation and we discover the magic of dishonesty. And we can do something and get away with it. I think every parent out there, they have that story, and they can tell you the story about how their sweet, innocent baby, how their little toddler lied to them. And I think that almost every parent, and most parents, can probably tell you the first time. Or they can tell you this really funny story about how they recognized that at some point their little baby lied to them. I remember when our oldest daughter was a baby, and we asked her a question, and she couldn't even talk yet. And we realized she's trying to deceive us before she could talk. I think every parent has that story. One of our really good friends was over at our house one time, and their daughter and our daughter were playing in our daughter's bedroom. Our daughter at that time was probably 2 years old, and theirs was probably about 4 years old. We heard a big crash, and we went running in there to see what was going on. And when we got in there, we discovered that there was a glass jar that we had seashells and sand in that had been sitting up on the very top of a dresser, was busted and all over the floor. And we cleaned it up, and we asked them what happened. And the 4-year-old said Tristan, our oldest daughter, had broken it. And we knew, our 2-year-old probably didn't crawl up on top of that dresser and get that thing down, and the 4-year-old could have reached it where it was at. And so we thought, well, And we even said something to the effect of, "Are you sure? Because, Tristan's only 2. She can't even reach it." And the mom looked at us and she shook her finger and she said, "My daughter does not lie." Well, it was about a week later. That family, they were sitting around their kitchen table, and their daughter just burst out in tears, and she screamed right in the middle of dinner, "I did it, I did it, I did it." And the mom said, "You did what?" Well, she said, "I'm the one who broke it, and I lied about it." And that mom had to call us, and I so respect that level of honesty. But that level of honesty is learned. But that mom called us and she said, "Hey, this is what happened. We were at dinner and my daughter said she's the one that broke the jar, and I wanted to tell you." We knew what had happened. There was zero doubt in our mind, but there was doubt in that mom's mind because that mom says, "My daughter would never lie." Let me tell you, parents, your kids will lie. Your kids will lie because we learn how to lie, and that behavior is never modeled before us. There are so many things that we do that are sins or that are wrong, and that behavior has to be modeled before us so that we learn to emulate that behavior. Lying is not one of them. We're born and we learn. It's a self-taught skill. That we learn that we can be deceitful and we can get what we want. And when we're under pressure and when there's some pleasure that we want, we learn that we can lie and that we can get what we want. And it's just this amazing self-taught skill that we have. Well, as parents, I think we need to realize that our kids do that, but we also need to realize that we do that. It's just a self-taught skill. Nobody has to teach us to lie, but we learn to lie. It's a skill that we learn. And as parents, what happens is once we recognize our kid has learned to lie, now we've got to tell them, don't do it. And we've got to teach them for the rest of their life not to do it, just as we have to, for the rest of our life, have to learn to not lie. We don't have to study any type of psychology to learn to lie, but we do learn to lie. And it's something that we have to work on, to not do, to handle truth and to handle honesty correctly. My wife, she tells a story about when she was a little girl. She had 3 brothers, and they would always go to this one particular uncle's house. And her brothers, they all hated going to this uncle's house. And they would go to the uncle's house, and then after they would leave, they would all complain and say how bad they didn't like that guy and how much they disliked him. And then when they would get home, they would talk about that. And then the next time they were going to go visit, all the brothers would talk about that. And one time they got to the uncle's house, and the uncle came and started picking on my wife when she's just a little bitty kid. He starts picking on her, and she looks up at him and she says, "My brothers don't like you." And they had this horrible social awkward moment, and the mom, her mom was grabbing her and saying, "Oh, no, no," and trying to cover up for it. And then her mom has to take her out later and say, "Don't ever say anything like that again." Well, as kids, we have to learn to how do we handle truth? One of my really good friends, his grandmother used to say all the time, "Always tell the truth, but don't be always telling it." As kids, we don't really understand. There are times we should say and times we shouldn't say. And there are times that it seems like we need to hold back, and there are times we need to give. And we have to spend our life learning when we should tell the truth. We always tell the truth, but we don't always go around telling it. And then we have to learn that behavior. I've tried to keep up with some of the psychological studies, and psychologists are really interested in deception and to study babies and how babies learn to deceive and when they learn to deceive. And one of the really interesting things that has come out over the last few years, psychologists would say, it's about 4 years old when babies learn, or when toddlers learn to lie. Now, over the last few years, there have been some studies that come out and that say, you know what? Really, we think that maybe around 6 months, about 6 months, your child has learned to deceive you. And I think every parent, you see this happen all the time. You will say, hey, did you make a stinky? And the kid will look at you and shake their head no. And you know that they did. You know that they did. We have to learn how to handle honesty. Really, it's kind of interesting, too, that God, He made us. There's something inside of us that makes us really poor liars. We're really bad at lying. We're really bad at it. But we learn the skill and we learn how to lie, but we really never perfect it. Before I came back to work for Heritage Christian University, I worked as a police officer. And I remember one of the very first weeks that I worked as a police officer, I was riding with one of my friends and we got a call of a domestic disturbance and we went to the guy's house. We asked him to come outside. He comes outside and my partner, like I said, this is probably my first week of work, and he says, hey, you stay out here and you talk to him and let me go inside and talk to the wife. And he did that. He went inside and I was nervous and I didn't know what to do. And I had the guy sit down on the driveway. I said, hey, sit down on the sidewalk. And he had a little step there where he could sit down on, because I thought, I don't want this guy to make a bolt or to jump me or something. And so I had him sit down. Then I started asking him questions. Hey, what happened? And he told me the story. He said, hey, here's what happened. We just argued a little bit. No big deal. Everything. We just kind of argued. I said, you didn't hit her? And he said, no. I said, there was no physical altercation. And he said, no. And he was weaving a pretty good yarn. He was telling me a pretty good story. After a few minutes, my partner comes out and he walks out of the house and he walks over to the guy and he says, hey, so tell me what happened. And the guy said exactly the same thing. He told the exact same story. And then my buddy Mike, he looks at him and he goes, well, what happened to his ear? What happened to her ear? Now the guy says, well, he kind of thought for a second. He said, we were wrestling around and we fell on the bed and her ear fell in my mouth and I accidentally bit it. And at this point, I thought, that is a little hard to believe. And then Mike looked at him and he said, well, what happened to her other ear? And the guy stopped and he just kind of had a blue screen crash for a moment. And he looked up at the sky and then he looked back at us and he said, same thing. Well, at that point, I think that he had just completely given up on the lie. We are just not good liars. We are bad liars because God did not create us to be liars. God created us to be honest. We were not born sinful, but we get there just about as fast as we can. Let's look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 37. Here in Matthew chapter 5, verse 37, Jesus says, but let your communication be yea, yea, and nay, nay, for whatsoever is more of these cometh evil. Why do we, when we go to court, why do we have to raise our right hand and swear to tell the whole truth? It's because we live in a society of liars. When I was going through the police academy, I took a class with an instructor who taught us a whole seminar on interrogation. And one of the points that he said was, when you've got a guy that you're talking to and he says, I swear on my mother's grave. He said, he may not be lying this time, but you're talking to a liar. And the reason is because, why do we have to take oaths? The reason we have to take oaths is because we are liars, but this time I'm not lying. I have to convince you that right now I'm not lying. Now, I always lie, but right now I'm not. I promise I'm telling the truth right now. Well, we have to learn not to lie. And Jesus says, when you say something, let your yes be yes and let your no be no. And we have to learn to do that. We have to learn to handle the truth right. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 9, let not lie not one to another, seeing that you have put off the old man with his deeds and have put on the new. We are told all throughout the Bible, repeatedly we are asked, don't lie. Don't lie. Deal honestly with each other. Deal forthrightly and correctly with each other, and don't lie and be deceptive. We have to learn that skill, though. We have to be told to not lie, and that's what God does. And we have to be taught to not lie. And that requires some work on our part. Because some things that we kind of lie to ourselves. We have to learn that when somebody calls on the phone, And they say, hey, let me talk to Bob, or, and they hand you the phone, and you don't want to talk to that person. And you say, oh, tell them I'm not here. We've got to learn that that's a lie. We may say, well, that's just a little white lie. Well, don't lie. We can't do that. Well, that's a lie. And we have to realize that when we're arguing with our spouse and our spouse says something to us and then we want to get them back, and so to make our argument stronger, we say, you always say that. And we know that really they don't always say that. But we just said that so that our argument sounds stronger. We got to learn that that's a lie. And we got to learn that when somebody asks us a question and we exaggerate, it's not poetry. We're not writing poetry, but we are exaggerating to ingratiate ourselves or to make ourselves sound better than what we actually are. When we exaggerate on our resume, we have to learn that's a lie. When we maybe you're a student and you write a paper and you take a quote from the internet and then you just change a couple of the words so maybe the plagiarism filter won't catch it, we've got to learn that that's a lie. And when we tell our kids, hey, if you do that one more time, I'm turning this car around, we've got to learn that empty threat, that's a lie. If you say, if you do that one more time or I'm turning this car around, when they do it one more time, you've got to turn that car around. Because if you're just making an empty threat, that's a lie. Or if you're a contractor and somebody says, how long is it going to be? How long are we going to be without this bathroom? And you say, well, we're going to have this done in 1 week. I promise you that. We're going to start on it next week. But you know that you're not starting on it next week. You know you're going to start on it in 2 weeks. And you know that they're going to be without a bathroom for 5 weeks. But you made an empty promise. That's a lie. That's a lie. That's what that is. And what we do is we kind of categorize these things and we say, well, these are bold lies and these are white lies. And we have to learn that they're just lies. In the book of Revelation, several times in the book of Revelation, he talks about liars. In Revelation 21:8, it says, but the fearful, the unbelieving, and the abominable, the murderers, the whoremongers, and the sorcerers, and idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. That's not hyperbole. Psalm 58, that's hyperbole. But this passage is not hyperbole. Revelation 28 is not hyperbole. And it's kind of amazing in the list that he puts that he puts liars in there. God knows that we learn to lie, and he tells us not to. And we've got to spend our life learning to tell the truth and to correctly handle the truth.
As the deep thirsts for the water, Lord, so my soul longs after you. My soul thirsts for the living God. Yes, my soul